Welcome everyone to Daf Yomi, 1 week at a time, Masechet Gittin. This is our 8th class, and today we actually have, we'll see how fast I can do it, but there's a lot to go through today. The Dapim this week were particularly long and a little gruesome, but we'll spare some of the gore. But we're going to begin at Daf 51, and I'm going to be reviewing till Daf 57, which was actually yesterday's Daf, just because I think the Dafim were so long that I'll save today's Daf for next week. Okay, so let's begin on Daf 51. Now, the Gemara explains to us that a person who stole a field from Reuven and then sold it to Shimon, so stole it from one person and then sold it to another person, and then Shimon, who bought the land, planted the field, and then when Reuven comes to take the field back from Shimon, he only needs to pay him the money that he used or that he invested to cultivate the field. He doesn't need to pay for the produce that's in the field at the time. When Shimon goes to the robber to get back his money, because again, he paid for the field, so then he can take from liened property for the land, but only free property for the fruit. So again, free property means what is in his possession. Now, liened property means property that was a guarantee for this sale, but was then subsequently sold to somebody else. So now the Gemara explains that a person, the case is that a person died and left 2 daughters and 1 son. So the son gets the inheritance, but each daughter gets 10% of the inheritance for her dowry. So let's say the first daughter comes and she takes her dowry, and then the son dies. So now so the son dies before, meaning the brother, before the second daughter could take her dowry. So now they need to divide the estate, because now she becomes an inheritor to the estate, right? It's just the 2 girls now. So the second one gives up her dowry, and now she gets 50% of the entire estate. But if she took 10% before, so then she can get it from liened land, right? Again, something that was sold, even though it was a guarantee, but even though if it wasn't written down. Okay, now we have the case of a husband. We actually learned this case in Ketuvot. We have a husband who promises to support his stepdaughter, right? He gets married, and the woman has a daughter from a previous marriage. So he promises to support the stepdaughter for 5 years. Then they get divorced, and she remarries, and this husband also promises to support the stepdaughter. So now they both need to support the stepdaughter. And if they die, she can collect from liened land because she's seen as a creditor, meaning they owe her the money. And again, but here the Gemara says only if they did an acquisition, a kinyan, like let's say they wrote it down in a document. But a regular daughter can only take money that's can only take her money that's owed to her from free land, because she gets it as an inheritor, as opposed to the stepdaughter who's getting it as a creditor. Okay. Let's say somebody returns an object. So they don't need to swear that they don't have, I'm so sorry. They don't need to swear that they didn't find anything else. And this is to continue with our tikkun olam. In general, if you admit to half of something, right? If you tell somebody, you owe me 100 shekel, and they say, what are you talking about? I only owe you 50 shekel. So they take an oath. They swear that they only owe 50 shekel. But here, let's say a person says, I found your wallet and in it was $5. And the guy says, what do you mean? My wallet had $10. So here the Gemara says that that person who's returning the money does not need to take an oath. And the idea is that we want to encourage people to return objects. If they're going to be made to swear, they're not going to return the objects. And what I mentioned before, the idea of taking an oath, if you admit to half of an item, so that's called modeh b'miktzat. You are admitting to half or a portion of what the actual amount is, the claim. And that person does need to take an oath, but they do not need to do so if they are returning a lost item. Okay, Daf 52, the Mishnah tells us a person who takes care of orphans, right? So a father died and left someone in charge to make sure that the orphans are taken care of. So that person needs to separate maaser, the tithes, for the orphans. If he was appointed by the father, so he needs to swear that he didn't take anything for himself. If he was appointed by the court, so then he doesn't have to swear, or we actually have an opposite opinion in the Mishnah as well. So now the Gemara explains. It says you need to take off truma, not your partner or the sharecropper or the apotropos. Again, the apotropos is somebody who is in charge or taking care of the orphans. So here it seems that the Gemara is telling us that the apotropos does not need or cannot separate trumot. So the Gemara says no. If the apotropos, again, the person who's in charge, Zohar says the guardian, thank you. So if the guardian is feeding the orphans, so then he can separate the trumot for the orphans. He can also sell anything that they own in order to feed them, but not just to make money for them, right? So he can, invest money for them, but he cannot just sell their property in order to get them a good price just to have money. He can use their money for something that has a fixed value, meaning he can buy them a lulav, tzitzit, a Torah scroll, tefillin, but he cannot use their money for charity or to redeem captives, because this does not have a fixed amount, and therefore we're concerned that he's going to spend more money than is necessary. The guardian cannot sell a field, one field of the orphans, to buy a closer field, because we're concerned that maybe that field is going to get ruined. He cannot sell a field to buy slaves because, again, slaves get old and they lose their value. And he cannot sell slaves for a field because it might get ruined. Again, as we mentioned before, a slave can buy his freedom from the guardian. Again, the guardian is in charge of the estate. So the slave can buy his own freedom. When the orphans grow up, the guardian needs to account for everything, right? Show an accounting of all the money and all the property, and then swear that this is all true. You cannot appoint women or slaves or minors as a guardian, because they cannot manage the estate, which is interesting. If nowadays they could manage the estate, what would that mean? However, if the father appoints them, they can be the guardian, which means there isn't something inherently forbidden about a woman being a guardian. If the father appointed her, so then it would be okay. Okay. And from here, the Gemara gives us some stories about Rabbi Meir, who really cared for people and made peace among the people. Okay, let's go back to property of the orphans. So the Gemara tells us that the property of the orphans is like hekdesh. Again, hekdesh is sanctified property, and you need to pay money to acquire it. We're going to see throughout this week's dapim that when someone makes a business deal, you need to acquire, you need to make a kinyan in order to become an owner. So there are different ways to acquire things. Generally, I would say the most common kinyan or acquisition would be via what's called mishicha, like pulling it towards you. But here, the Gemara tells us that for orphans, in order to acquire their property, you need to pay money, and mishicha, taking it, is not enough of an acquisition. And then there's stories about this in the Gemara. Let's say the guardian is doing a business deal for the orphans. If the value went up before the guardian paid for the produce, he doesn't need to pay the higher price. Again, the point of the Gemara here is to show that we are going to protect the orphans any way we can. So if there's a discrepancy in the price, the orphans are going to get the best deal. If the guardian is losing or damaging money for the orphans, so then he's basically fired because he's not doing his job properly. If he was appointed by the court, then he doesn't get paid generally, and therefore he doesn't need to swear because really he's just doing a favor. Or maybe it's the opposite. Everyone knows he's honest because the court appointed him, therefore he needs to swear. Or maybe both have to swear, whether they were appointed by the father or appointed by the court. Okay, the next Mishnah on Daf 52 teaches us that if a person makes someone else's produce impure or mixes it with truma or uses it to, let's say, someone else's wine, he takes someone else's wine and uses it as a libation or we're not sure. Let's say a non-Jew pours out some of the wine. All of these things are a type of damage that's called unseen damage, meaning it didn't break, it didn't get ruined in a physical sense, but there is a change to the spiritual state of the item, and therefore there is a type of damage, and we'll see how each one is damaged. So if a person does any one of these three things, so if it was inadvertent, they are exempt, they do not have to pay. But if it was deliberate, so then they are liable. So just to go through each one of these things, if food became impure, if it's truma, so then nobody can eat it, right? But the priest, the kohen, can get benefit from it, meaning let's say if it's oil, he can burn it, use it in a lamp. If you took regular food and you mixed it with truma, so then Yisrael, a regular Jew, cannot eat it, but it can be sold to a Kohen, to a priest, because he can eat truma, so he can eat it, so that lowers the value. And yain nesech, meaning if a non-Jew touched wine, so then it's forbidden for anybody to get benefit. So there are different levels here of benefit that we've been discussing. So now the Gemara goes through it. If you did the libations or yain nesech, so then that would be you would be liable for capital punishment. And if you remember, we learned a concept called kimle midirabamine. That's Aramaic. And that means that if you become simultaneously, and it has to be simultaneous, if you become simultaneously liable for capital punishment and punitive damages, meaning you have to pay money as well, you end up, because you're getting capital punishment, you don't have to pay, meaning you get the more stringent punishment and you do not get the lower punishment. So the Gemara says that if you damaged in this way, you are liable for capital punishment. So therefore, you for doing a libation to idols, and therefore you would be exempt from paying damages. Or no, maybe you're still liable. Again, maybe you did it in a way that it wasn't simultaneous, and therefore you would still be liable. Okay, daf 53. Maybe we're talking about mixing nisuch, again, the wine that was used for libations for idolatry, with regular produce. And here the Gemara tells us that there's a prohibition to make regular produce impure, right? In general, it should remain pure. And therefore, these three cases, each one of them is damaging the produce. So it's actually a machloket if unrecognizable damage is considered damage or not. And that's the machloket here on this Gemara. If you did it on purpose, you would definitely tell the owner, and then they would know about it. So Chizkiah says, biblically, it is considered damage. Rabbi Yochanan says, biblically, it's not considered damage. And therefore, if you did it inadvertently, you are, or on purpose, you are exempt. But the rabbis made it so that if you did it on purpose, you'd be liable, so that people won't go around making things impure just because they feel like it. If the Kohen makes a korban, a sacrifice, invalid because of wrong thoughts. This is, if you remember, this is called pigul. Pigul means that when the Kohen was sacrificing the animal, he was thinking about eating it on the wrong day or in the wrong place. Like, oh, I can't wait to have this meat in a barbecue at the beach in Tel Aviv. That would be called pigul, even though it's with his thoughts. So if he does it on purpose, he is liable. Again, because of tikkun olam, right? We don't want people doing this on purpose. Or maybe if it was inadvertent, he is not liable. He's exempt. Again, because of tikkun olam. If you use the water of the para aduma, the red heifer ashes with the water, if you misappropriate it, meaning you use it for work, or you use the actual para aduma, the red heifer, for work, so you're exempt, but you're liable in a heavenly court. And there's a case where they brought the red heifer calf into the barn to nurse from the mother, and then the person thought, oh, this would be so good if he would just thresh the grain that's there. Okay, let's say a person stole a coin and then it's taken out of circulation, or you stole truma and then it became impure, or chametz, and then it was Pesach. So all of these things, what do you do with them, right? Do you just, the Gemara seems to imply you can just return them without doing anything or paying for the damage. And that proves that unrecognizable damage is not considered damage, and therefore you're not liable to pay for it if you do this type of damage. It is important to recognize that if someone damages somebody else's property, real physical damage, it doesn't matter if it's by accident or on purpose. You have to pay for those damages. There might be a different value that you need to pay, but you always need to pay damages. And that's why here the Gemara is asking, what about when it's unrecognizable? Is it considered damage or not? Okay, let's say, and the Gemara goes through different cases where things have a difference between doing them on purpose or doing them inadvertently. So let's say you planted a tree on Shabbat, which you're not allowed to do. If you do it inadvertently, you can leave it. If you do it on purpose, you need to uproot it. Let's say you planted the tree on Shemitah, which is also you're not allowed to do, on the 7th year. So either way, you have to uproot it. Or the Gemara says maybe it's the opposite. So the question is, why is there a difference between Shabbat and Shemitah? Right? Both of them are biblical, but Shemitah, people actually date their trees by the year it was planted. Therefore, everyone's going to know if this tree was planted on Shemitah year, and therefore you have to uproot it. But if it's planted on Shabbat, no one's going to know when it was planted. Daf 54 tells us that the reason the Shemitah is more stringent is because people were actually suspected of not keeping Shemitah, but people kept Shabbat, and therefore they did not have to uproot those trees if it was inadvertent. Or, no, people were also very careful about Shemitah as well. I think this is very interesting to get a kind of a glimpse into what people were doing in the time of the Mishnah and the Gemara, right? Are most people keeping Shabbat or not? Are people keeping Shemitah or not? It's interesting, these lines, even though they seem kind of under the radar, they actually really do shed a lot of light as to what went on in that time. Okay, Daf 54. If a non-Kohen eats truma, which they're not allowed to do, if they do it by accident, he needs to replace it with regular produce. And then it becomes truma. If he pays him, again, he's paying the Kohen back for the things that he took. If he pays him with something that is impure, so if he does it by accident, so then it works. If he does it on purpose, so then it doesn't work. Or the sages say both of them work, but there's a penalty, and he therefore has to also pay with pure produce as well. Or if he ate with pure truma, so then he has to repay it with pure regular food, meaning chulin. If he ate truma that was impure, so then you can pay it back with anything. Let's say a Kohen is in the temple, and let's say the blood of the sacrifice becomes impure, and if it becomes impure, they need to throw it out, but instead he threw it onto the altar. If he throws it onto the mizbeach, onto the altar anyway, so if he did it by accident, it's okay. And if it didn't, if he did it on purpose, so then it doesn't work. So again, all of these cases have a component of doing something you're not allowed to do. And if you do it by accident, it's okay. And if you did it on purpose, so then it doesn't work. Okay, if you separated Maser on Shabbat, again, if you did it by accident, it works. On purpose, it doesn't. If you purified a vessel on Shabbat, the same idea. Inadvertently, it works. On purpose, it doesn't work. But again, these cases are the sages are not penalizing the shogeg, the inadvertent, because the person is trying to improve a situation. You're trying to make the vessel pure. You're trying to make the food pure. But if not, so then it doesn't work. Sorry, lots of yawning today. If you have a tree that is under 3 years old or 3 years old and under, and it gets mixed up in a set of other trees, so you can't pick the trees. And if you do, so then it will be nullified if you picked from 200 other fruits, meaning as long as you have 1 in 200, it becomes nullified. Okay, next Mishnah. If the Kohen does pigul, again, pigul was the improper thoughts while bringing a sacrifice. So then, again, if they did on purpose, so then they are liable. And if they didn't, so then, and if they, so, okay, the Mishnah says, if they did on purpose, so then they are liable. So now let's get to the Gemara. So the Gemara says that a person is believed to say that pure food became impure, or that a korban, a sacrifice, became pigul, right? But if the person says the food that was here, that was pure, so now it's impure, I made it impure yesterday, so in the past, so then they're not believed. So the Gemara explains why. If it happened today, so then you still have the power to make it impure or pigul, meaning, wrong time or place. So therefore, you're still believed for that day, but you're not believed about yesterday because it's not in your control anymore. You don't have it anymore. Or if you don't say anything to the person the first time you saw them, and then you saw them again, and then you told them, so then you're not believed. Again, the idea is that if you didn't tell them the first time, so then we don't believe you when you say it the second time. Okay, let's say a person says, the Sefer Torah, the Torah scroll that I just wrote, I didn't have the proper intent when I was writing it. So if the Torah was sold already, so then the scribe loses his wages, but the Torah scroll is not invalidated, meaning the Torah scroll is still valid because again, here the scribe cannot invalidate the Torah if it's not in his possession anymore. It's a machloket if you can write over God's name with proper intent in order to fix the Torah, or only once. You can do that only once, but you can't do it on an entire Torah. And therefore, it calls into question the validity of the Torah, right? Let's say he says, I didn't tan the parchment with proper intent, so he loses his wages, and the Torah now is disqualified. So the Gemara says, why is that? Because here, when we were talking about God's name, we're concerned maybe he would only lose his wages of the words that he didn't have proper intent with. But here, we're talking about the entire Torah scroll, and therefore, he is believed to disqualify it. Okay, next Mishnah on Daf 55. We have the testimonies of Rabbi Yochanan ben ben Gudgeda. He gave certain testimonies. This is in Masachet Eduyot. In that Masachet, we have all the testimonies of different sages. So he said, a deaf girl that was married off by her father can get divorced with a get, right? You don't need da'at, right, cognitive ability, in order to get a divorce. He also said that if a minor was married off by her mother or her brother, meaning it's dirabanan, it's only a rabbinical level marriage, and let's say she was a Yisrael, and they married her to a Kohen, she can eat truma, and she inherits him if he dies. Meaning, even though the marriage is only rabbinic, it's a full-fledged marriage. Therefore, she can eat truma, and she inherits the husband. Let's say, another case, let's say a person stole a beam and then used it to build their house. So you only have to pay back the value of that beam, and he does not have to break down his house and give the beam back to the person that he stole it from. Okay. And the last one is if a person stole an animal and then sanctified it as a chatat, as a sin offering, so then that does work. So now the Gemara is going to explain all of these ideas. From the Mishnah, we can learn that if a person showed a document to witnesses and he says, you see, I wrote a get to my wife, and then he hands the get to his wife and he says, here, this is just a debt document. It's not a get. So she's still divorced because we don't need her, meaning again, he's like tricking her, but the Gemara says that we don't need her consent in order to get divorced, which is not true nowadays. Nowadays, a person cannot get divorced unless both sides agree to the divorce. But biblically, you do not need her to admit it. Therefore, it works and she is still divorced. You might have thought that he's nullifying it by calling it a debt document and not a bill of divorce. The answer is no, because he told the witnesses beforehand, so then it works, right? Maybe he's too embarrassed to divorce his wife. As we said, the deaf-mute girl who's an adult is married to a Kohen. She can't, so we talked about it being a real marriage. However, the Gemara tells us that this girl who's married to Kohen cannot eat truma because we're concerned that you might think that the opposite is true, that if the Kohen is deaf and he marries a regular girl, that she could eat truma. The answer is she cannot eat truma. Therefore, there was a decree from one to the other. Okay, we talked about the beam. So Beit Shammai says you have to actually break down the whole house and return the beam. Beit Hillel say you just pay back the money of the beam. Back to the animal. So the case is, hold on. The Gemara says that a stolen animal cannot be an offering, right? A sin offering, even if it wasn't known to the public. So according to Ula, even if the owner of the animal despaired, meaning gave up, or had yeush, right? If he gave up, it isn't enough to transfer ownership to the thief to be able to sanctify the animal. So how is this working? So our Mishnah says that the sacrifice is okay so that the priest, the Kohen, isn't saddened about eating forbidden meat. But really, it doesn't work. Therefore, right, but here the sages say, you know what, it does work because we don't want the Kohanim to be upset that they ate something that was forbidden. Okay, or maybe, one second, or whether they know about the animal or not, it is because it is an atonement, because that yeush, that giving up of the owner, is enough for the thief to acquire it completely, and then he can sanctify it as a sacrifice. Again, they made a decree that if it's public knowledge that it was stolen, so then it does not atone for the sins. Because again, we're concerned that you might think, oh, I could just steal my neighbor's goat and bring it as a sacrifice. Okay. Now, the Gemara continues that. So let's go to the next Mishnah. The next Mishnah discusses a law called sikrikon. Sikrikon is a law that if a Jew should. Okay, so the law is that a Jew should buy Jewish land that was seized by an idolater from other Jews. So it seems that, right, these idolaters came and said, we're going to kill you. And they said, no, take my land and don't kill me. So this generally happened during the destruction of the Second Temple. And the Mishnah tells us that this law didn't apply in the area of Yehuda, of Judah. That's the area of Yerushalayim and south of Jerusalem. It's actually where I'm sitting right now. So when people were in this time, when people were being killed by the Romans during the war, because if they were really, really afraid of their lives and they thought they were going to die, so then they really did sell the property. But afterwards, it did apply. And we're going to see that after the war, the Romans actually protect the Jews. And therefore, when the sikrikon, when they take the field, he's not really giving up on it. Therefore, when you buy that land, you have to give it back to me because I never really gave up on my hopes that I would get it back. So here the Mishnah is going to teach us the law. If a Jew buys land from the sikrikon, so then it goes back to the original owner and he gives it to him as a gift. So it's not a valid transfer as a gift because we assume that the original owner didn't really want to give it to him. And then the land really should go back to the original owner. If first he bought the land or received it as a gift from the original owner, and they bought it from the sikrikon, so then that does work. If a person bought land from a husband and then bought a lien from the wife, it doesn't work because we assume she's afraid of the husband, and therefore that's why she sold it. But if you did the opposite, meaning the woman first and then the man, so then that would work. The later courts deemed, so all of this seems to be the earlier courts. The later courts decreed, if you buy a land from the sikrikon, you only need to give a quarter of the value to the original owner. But if the original owner has the funds to buy the field, so then only he can buy it. But if there was more than 12 months since the sikrikon took the field, so then anyone can buy it. But you still should give a quarter of the value to the owner. Okay, so now the Gemara discusses originally since we're talking about the time of the destruction of the temple, the next two dapim are going to be all about stories, some of them gruesome. I did not bring details, but some of them very gruesome, some of them very famous, about the time period of the destruction of the temple. So the Gemara says that originally Titus made a decree that if you don't kill a Jew, you're going to be killed, meaning it was a really bad time to be a Jew in this place, right, in Israel. Therefore, when the idolater got the land, the sikrikon, so it was given over seriously because they thought they were going to die. Therefore, the law of sikrikon does not apply because they gave the land freely, because it was really an acquisition. But after the war, anybody who killed a Jew would be killed. Now we have the opposite. Therefore, if they gave up the land, it wasn't really an acquisition because he thought he was going to get it back. Okay, so Jerusalem, the Gemara tells us at the bottom of 55, Jerusalem was destroyed because of the story of Kamta and Bar Kamta. This is a very famous story about the destruction of the temple and what we call Sinat Chinam, right? The unprecedented or right free hate. Everyone hated each other. Nobody loved each other. I think it is extremely fitting that as we are in the 3 weeks, the weeks between the 17th of Tammuz till Tisha B'Av, when we are mourning the destruction of both temples, we're now going to hear many terrible stories of that time period. So the Gemara tells us Jerusalem was destroyed because of Kamta and Bar Kamta. So the story is that there was a man who had a friend named Kamta and an enemy named Bar Kamta. I think that if you have friends with two of the same names, you should either like them both or not like them, but this could definitely lead to trouble, which did. So he said to invite Kamta, but they invited Bar Kamta instead. So then he sees him at the party and he says, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "I got invited." And he said, "I don't want you here." So he tries to throw him out and he begs him to stay. Right? He says, "Look, I'm already here. Please, please, can I stay? I'll pay for my meal. I'll pay for the whole party." And he says no, and he kicks him out. And it seems that there were rabbis at this party, and they didn't intercede. They didn't say anything. They didn't rebuke the person. So Bar Kamta was so upset that he decided to tell on these rabbis. So he told the Caesar that these rabbis were rebelling against him. What's the proof? He said, "Look, send a sacrifice." He tells the Caesar, "Send a sacrifice, and let's see what happens." So he sends the most beautiful animal, and Bar Kamta, since he's filled with hatred, actually blemishes the animal very slightly, but enough to make it unable to be put on the altar. And then, right, he says, "Look, you sent such a beautiful animal, and they won't sacrifice it. It must be that they hate you." And it seems that God on that day decreed that the temple should be destroyed. Nero, another Caesar, a Caesar, was going to attack Jerusalem. So he shot arrows to the direction of all four winds, and all the arrows ended up pointing to Jerusalem. But then he realized that God wanted Jerusalem destroyed, but he would also get punished for doing it. So he decided to convert, and Rabbi Meir came from him. So this is interesting that a lot of the stories that we're going to hear, as terrible as they are kind of bookended by stories of terrible Romans who end up converting to Judaism. So I think it's interesting. I think the Gemara is trying to say, never give up hope. Okay, so now we have Vespasian, who besieges Jerusalem for 3 weeks, right? That's Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, the 17th of Tammuz. And the Gemara tells us that there were actually 3 rich men who lived in Jerusalem at the time. Now, again, Jerusalem, when I say Jerusalem at the time of the destruction, we're talking about the old city of Jerusalem. So you're trapped in a walled area. And there were these three rich men who lived in Jerusalem, and they had enough food to sustain them for 21 years. The rabbis wanted to make peace with the Romans, and the zealots wanted to fight. So they decided to burn all the food, and they thought that that would force everyone to fight, but instead it actually forced famine. And you should just know there's a, I wonder if it's in English, I'm not sure, but there's a movie, I wonder if it's on YouTube. There was a movie that came out a few years ago, an Israeli filmmaker made an animated movie about the destruction of the temple. I think it was called Khurban. It's a movie about the destruction of the temple, and that movie really focuses on the baseless hatred that was going around during the Second Temple period. And you really see that here with these warring factions, with the fact that they're burning food when they're in the middle of a siege. Really just terrible stories. The Gemara continues with Marta bat Baitus, who was the richest woman in Jerusalem, and she basically couldn't find anything to eat. There's no food. It really, reading these stories really remind me of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, of the terrible stories of famine, of disease, of really just suffering. So the Gemara talks about Marta looking for food, and she can't find food. And then she goes out without her shoes because she doesn't even have shoes, and she steps on animal dung, and she's so repulsed that she dies on that spot. Rabbi Tzadok, who lived at this time in Jerusalem, fasted for 40 years so that the temple won't be destroyed. It didn't work. So now we're going to, so Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was, so his nephew, yes, was the head of these zealots, of the Biryonim, of these zealots who wanted to fight the Romans. And he asked him to help him get out of Jerusalem so he can save the Jewish people. Again, a very famous story. So he tells him, okay, I'll sneak you out of Jerusalem. How are you going to do it? Pretend that you're sick, and then pretend that you die, and have your students carry you out. And then Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai went to meet Vespasian, who's again laying siege on Jerusalem, and he calls him my king. And he said, wait a minute, why are you doing that? I'm not the king, I'm just the general. And he said, no, you're destined to become the king because God is giving you Jerusalem. And at that moment, a messenger came and told Vespasian that the Caesar died and that he is the new king. So Vespasian offers him to grant him 3 wishes. So one is he asks for Yavne and the sages, Tenli Yavne v'chachamea. He wants to establish the Davidic line of leadership in Yavne. Number 2 was the family, to spare the family of Rabban Gamliel, again, the royal line of David. And number 3 is a doctor for Rabbi Tzadok. Some say that he, was wrong, that he really should have asked for Jerusalem not to be destroyed. Others say that that would have been too much, and he never would have had his wish come true. Okay, so the Gemara describes how the doctor healed Rabbi Tzadok by slowly increasing the amount of food. Again, this is unfortunately like very reminiscent of the Holocaust, where people didn't eat for so long that a lot of them died after the war when they just see food and they eat and their stomachs can't handle it. So this is exactly the case with Rabbi Tzadok. They slowly increased his intake every day, and that's how he was cured. Vespasian returns to Rome, and he sent the evil Titus to destroy Jerusalem. He had, and the Gemara describes now how terrible Titus is. He has relations with a harlot on a Sefer Torah in the Kodesh HaKodeshim, in the holiest of holy places. And he slashes the parochet, the curtain, with a sword, and blood comes out. And he thought that he actually killed God. He collected all the vessels of the Beit HaMikdash and sent them by boat to Rome. And he thought that God only punishes people on the water, and therefore, and therefore God says to him, you think I can't kill you on land? I'll kill you on land. So he waits till he lands on the land, and then he says, I'll just kill you there. And the Gemara describes a gnat enter a yitush, even though nowadays we say yitush is a mosquito, but some very small insect enters his nose and goes up into his brain and stays there for 7 years. And when he dies finally from this yitush, the Gemara describes a disgusting, I guess they did an autopsy, and inside they found really bad things in his skull. Okay, Daf 57, we have the story of Onkelos. Those of you who are familiar in the Torah, if you open up a Hebrew Bible with commentary, the oldest commentary is that of Onkelos. He wrote a commentary in Aramaic, and it's usually right next to the Torah. And the Gemara tells us that Onkelos was the nephew of Titus. Again, evil people leading to converts to Judaism. So he wanted to convert Onkelos, so he raises Titus up from the dead. He also raises Bilam up from the dead, and he asks them if he should convert. And they say, Jews are the most prominent in the next world, but don't convert to Judaism. Like, it's not a good idea. Both were actually punished very severely in the next world. Then he went to a sinner of Israel who said, you should seek their benefit and don't harm them, meaning you should convert to Judaism. Okay, so and the Gemara says that the story of Kamta Bar Kamta, because he was shamed, God destroyed the Beit HaMikdash. Another story of the destruction is a story about a rooster and a hen, and that also led to the destruction. That led to the destruction of Har HaMelech, which we're going to see was a very large city of Jews. Some Romans took away this rooster and a hen. They were actually used as a ceremonial thing before a wedding. They brought them to the groom and the bride. They're a symbol of fertility. And when the Romans took them, the Jews decided to kill those Romans. Unfortunately, Rome heard about this death and realized that the people were rebelling against them. So then they came to fight at Har HaMelech. Here, the Gemara describes the battle, and then they think, okay, you know what, forget it, we're not going to destroy the whole city. And then the Jews rejoice so much that he comes back and he decides he is going to destroy the whole city. From here, we have stories of the people of Sachania that were righteous, or they sought justice, even when people did bad things. But the city was destroyed anyway. And the Gemara describes why were they destroyed? Because they didn't mourn Jerusalem properly. Again, as I mentioned, very appropriate for our 3 weeks. Beitar, which is a city about 15 minutes from here, was actually destroyed in the time of the Khurban, I mean afterwards, but in that time period. And they were destroyed because of a carriage, the side of a carriage. What's the story? The carriage of the Caesar's daughter broke down near Beitar, and the attendants went out and saw the cedar tree, and they cut it down and they used the wood for the daughter's carriage, but they didn't know that these were sacred trees. They were the custom was that they were planted when a baby was born, and then used for that person's canopy when they get married. So the people of Beitar were so upset that they killed these Romans, and of course the Caesar gets very upset. He's told that the Jews are rebelling, so the Caesar sent an army and slaughtered all of Beitar. Then there's a description of Zechariah, the prophet. His blood is boiling on the floor of the temple, and it drives Titus crazy. It only sorry, not Titus. This is Nebuzaradan. It only stopped after Nebuzaradan killed all of the Sanhedrin and children and girls. And then he threatened to continue killing people if it didn't stop boiling. So they did. However, because of this, right, when it stopped, he actually decided to do tshuva and convert. Again, another story of conversion. Okay, the Gemara talks about other people who also, right, a list of evil people who either they convert or their descendants convert and become scholars. Daf 57 talks about the Psalm Al Naharot Babel, right, by the rivers of Babylon. He says that God showed David both temples being destroyed. If you remember, neither of them exist in the time of King David. The Romans took, back to talking about terrible stories, the Romans take 400 boys and girls from Jerusalem or from Israel, and they take them to Rome in order to perform sexual acts. The girls and then the boys decide to jump into the sea and kill themselves al Kiddush Hashem in order to sanctify God's name and not to be taken to Rome. The Gemara ends with the very tragic story of Hannah and her 7 sons. Each one is brought up and told that they need to bow down to an idol, otherwise they're going to get killed, and they don't. Each one refuses to bow down. Each one is killed. When Hannah, when her 7th son is killed, she is so distraught she falls from the roof or jumps from the roof, and a heavenly voice says, before she dies, she says to her last son, when you die, tell Abraham, Abraham tried to sacrifice one son or was ready to sacrifice one son, and Hannah, she says, she is prepared to sacrifice 7 children. But unfortunately, she cannot take it anymore, and she falls from the roof, and a bat kol comes out, a voice comes out and says, Em habanim smecha, the mother of these boys is happy. And the Gemara says that's because they sanctified the name of God. We are going to stop at these, in the middle of these stories. We're going to get a few more next week. I want to wish everyone a Shabbat Shalom. And next week we will meet our new regular time and day, which is Wednesday night. So next Wednesday, Be'ezrat Hashem, we will learn together at 9 p.m. Israel time, and wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you, Rosa.